Hello, today I wanted to take a look at a book by Richard E. Schroeder called The Foundations of the CIA, Harry Truman, the Missouri Gang, and the Origins of the Cold War. This is a book that I recently reviewed for Intelligence and National Security, an academic journal. And just a small little book, but it was kind of interesting, and I just wanted to talk about that a little bit today. So this book is... well, let me start by saying, so Harry Truman's presidency was one of the most dynamic of the 20th century. I mean, easily, very dynamic. I mean, the guy oversaw, the dropping of the atomic bombs, but you saw the Marshall Plan, you saw the Berlin blockade, you saw the reforming the army and the integrating the army, and the formalization of the Joint Chiefs and those sorts of things. You saw the Korean War, just many different incredible international crises, as well as, like I say, these national reforms at home marked his presidency, and he really was a dynamic president, and in a lot of ways, I think you could make the case that he was a more dynamic president than Roosevelt and Eisenhower, his predecessor and successor. And I know Victor Davis Hanson wrote a column about this a while ago where he talked about how Truman was perceived as being a loose cannon. You had Roosevelt, who was very charming and he looked competent, and he could sail the ship of state quite well. And then, of course, the same thing with Eisenhower. Here you'd had the guy that many thought won World War II. He certainly had a huge hand in it, and again he kind of projected this competence and engendered confidence in people. And by contrast, Harry Truman just looked like this kind of country bumpkin. He looked like this guy who didn't have any tact, who kind of just would say the first thing that entered his head. Most people, I think, thought he was well-intentioned, but there was the thing of maybe he wasn't entirely competent. He wasn't entirely capable of running the country. Certainly not to the level of either his predecessor or successor. And it's hard to imagine, though, Roosevelt or Eisenhower kind of meeting the challenges that Truman did in quite the same way. And I don't want to go too much into that, because I'd rather stick to the book, but it's just kind of an interesting way of looking at his presidency there. So Schroeder, who wrote this book, Richard E. Schroeder, he himself is a former CIA officer. I believe he teaches foreign policy courses at Georgetown, if I'm not mistaken there. The book itself, of course, is about fundamentally the beginnings of the Cold War here, with Harry Truman establishing the CIA. That's obviously what the book kind of revolves around. The idea revolves around. Truman had said, "I got a couple of admirals together, and it was with these admirals that he was able to create the Central Intelligence Agency." The admirals he referred to were William Leahy and Sidney Sowers, who was the first DCI, if I recall correctly, and then the other one was Roscoe Hillenkotter. And Roscoe Hillenkotter and Sidney Sowers were both admirals from Missouri. So very often this term Missouri Gang was used to describe this group around Truman, these admirals around Truman, because they... it was kind of a derisive term by Truman's political enemies. It kind of invoked the Pendergast machine, which put Truman into power, got him his job as a senator, and so it was kind of used kind of derisively by people who opposed the creation of the CIA, and there were quite a few who did for various reasons. Schroeder writes about Truman that he, quote, recognized that beyond weapons, soldiers, and generals, the United States needed spies, researchers, and analysts, and an experienced intelligence manager to coordinate and lead American intelligence efforts. And that's on page 3. And I should point out, this is a very small book. This is only about 140 pages of text. It's a very thin book there. So, there was a recognition by Harry Truman kind of belatedly after he dissolved the OSS, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. But there was a need for an intelligence gathering service. Essentially, Truman wanted a daily newspaper. He wanted to have kind of all the intelligence threats and problems around the world given to him every day in kind of an easily digestible, easily readable format for him, which in and of itself is quite certainly it anticipated the way the White House was going to be running from there on out, with the president being regularly informed, daily informed about various threats around the world. We see that more today with the NSA. So the book begins kind of talking about the years before World War II, specifically the role of, for instance, the two main official intelligence gathering organs the United States had was the Military Intelligence Division and the Office of Naval Intelligence. Now combined, both of these agencies had maybe 140 employees, maybe not even 140 employees. So these were not high priority agencies that were used here in the for their intended purpose. Intelligence was not prioritized. The most of the intelligence that did come into the United States was via the military attachés in embassies. These are the military officers that served in various embassies throughout the world, and there was a great book that came out a few years ago by Thomas Mencken, I believe, called Uncovering Ways of War. And Uncovering Ways of War, essentially, it talks about these military attachés in Germany, in Japan, in Britain, and how they were gathering intelligence prior to World War II on these different nations. And it's very interesting. And one of the ideas he comes up with is frequently the United States would do what he called mirror imaging, meaning they would say that whatever the United States military was working on, whatever tactics, technologies they were working on, they kind of assumed everyone else was too, and so they would kind of read into what they were seeing in other countries the same things they were pursuing themselves, and it kind of reinforced their own thinking, and it a lot of times failed to appreciate how these other countries were developing these other concepts and technologies and what have you in their own way. A very interesting book. But a good part of this book, of Schroeder's book, deals with this kind of how these military attachés work. In fact, Roscoe Hillenkotter, who was one of these admirals that'll help him found the CIA, Roscoe Hillenkotter served as military attaché for a while. I believe he was in Paris for a while. Worked with Admiral Leahy and I think William Bullitt, who were the ambassadors to France and Vichy France for a while. And he, again, got his primary intelligence for the nation by meeting with various officials of the host government, of just kind of conversations through open source newspapers and stuff like that. So it's real low tech intelligence gathering that was going on here, and that was again America's primary intelligence gathering. This is at a time where you have the Deuxième Bureau, I think it's pronounced for the French. You had of course the SD and the Abwehr in Germany. Of course, you had the Soviet, the NKVD had an intelligence arm, and the MVD for the army. MI5. You had all these various dedicated intelligence organs around the world, around Europe certainly at this time, and the United States lagged behind in that aspect. Now, about approximately half the book deals with events that take place just before and during World War II. Again, it's the foundations of the CIA, looking about how the CIA was built up here. Now, Schroeder, of course, spent some time talking about William J. Donovan, who was the guy who really had the vision for a unified intelligence agency initially. Roosevelt named him the coordinator of intelligence, and of course eventually this leads to the creation of the Office of Strategic Services, the OSS, which was an intelligence and sabotage agency that was created by the United States at this time. It had very kind of there was a broad interpretation about exactly what it was going to do, but its mandate was ill-defined. It didn't really, the OSS was not really, a lot of people in the military sphere didn't know what to make of it. Now, the Joint Chiefs of Staff had theoretical authority over it, but the Joint Chiefs of Staff at this time too was still kind of finding out exactly what its authority was, because the Joint Chiefs of Staff at this time did not have legal authority. That's going to come later with the reforms under Truman post-war. But during the war, the Joint Chiefs of Staff was more kind of a organ to coordinate military policy and strategy and all those sorts of things with the president. The OSS does kind of prove its worth initially with the the torch landings in North Africa. The OSS had successfully kind of backed local groups to help support the invasion, and it kind of impressed people. It had its research and analysis division, which was pretty quickly a lot of the military groups were realizing, okay, we can use this. There's something here for us. So it kind of gained a little steam at that time. Now Schroeder spends a little bit of time talking about some of these OSS operations. For instance, he talks about the Jedburghs, which of course were kind of, not really guerrillas isn't the word, but they were kind of specialized teams that were operated in France in around the time of D-Day and post D-Day, and causing a lot of problems for the Germans in France and working with the resistance. And then he has he talks a little bit about operations in Germany, OSS agents that were penetrating into Germany. Talks a little bit about Reinhard Gehlen, who is Hitler's head of intelligence for the Foreign Armies East, which specifically he was charged with. He was the head of army intelligence dealing with the Soviets and their allies in the eastern part of the country after, I think, 1942 or thereabouts. And of course, he later defects to the United States and brings kind of his agency with him, because the United States is very interested in learning how the Soviets fought that war after World War II. Now the problem is Schroeder doesn't really delve into any of these subjects, and they're all fascinating subjects, but he doesn't kind of really get into them. It's all kind of surface level, just kind of basically talks about it, in a couple of paragraphs or so, and that's too bad. And there's some great books on these subjects. Colin Bevan, I think his name was, wrote a good book on the Jedburghs. Kind of popular history, but it was still pretty good. Joseph Persico wrote a great book called Piercing the Reich, which was about OSS agents penetrating Nazi Germany. Again, kind of a popular history, but it was pretty informative, and it was pretty interesting. And I like Persico. I think Persico is a kind of a fun historian. Again, writes a lot of popular stuff, but I like Persico, and that was a particularly good book. I really enjoyed Piercing the Reich quite a bit. I actually just reviewed for Intelligence National Security a few months back a book by Magnus Paul, a German historian, called Hitler's Fremde hier Ost, which essentially was Foreign Armies East, which essentially dealt with Gehlen, and it kind of delves more into kind of what Gehlen was doing and how and why he was able to defect or kind of make contact with the West and then start working for the United States. Good book. More of an academic book. That one's not a popular history. That was a pretty heavy academic book. Now, the second half of the book deals a lot with this very contentious birth of the CIA. This very you have this political and bureaucratic construction of this agency, and of course, because it's got such a broad mandate as the OSS had, it creates clashes, turf wars with various other figures, most notably your military, your naval intelligence people, your army intelligence people, and so forth. Now, Truman, of course, had disbanded the OSS in 1945, shortly after the end of the war, largely because he feared, and this is generally well known, he feared it could become an American Gestapo. He feared that the Germans, or pardon me, the OSS could be listening in to American conversations, could be arresting Americans, could have their own private jails or camps like the Germans, pardon me. So he was very fearful of that possibility that America could use this instrument in kind of the same way that totalitarian nations had, specifically Germany had, and that's why it was disbanded. But again, it becomes quickly apparent, as I mentioned earlier, he realized this new era was going to require, in order, if we're going to go toe to toe with the Soviets, who did not have our best interests at heart, then we needed to have a smarter, more streamlined way of gathering intelligence against them and against their plans. Now, Schroeder, again, really spends relatively a lot of time, because it's, again, a tiny book, talking about kind of these bureaucratic turf wars. He wrote that in the 2 years after the OSS was abolished, and we'll see very quickly, we'll get the establishment of kind of a basic framework for the CIA, but he wrote in these 2 years after the OSS was abolished, quote, "Most Washington maneuvering about intelligence management had more to do with who should direct the various departmental intelligence officers, and less about Donovan's vision that intelligence professionals should be combined within a single organization, or a desire for a single agency to produce Truman's newspaper." That's page 87. They were not, most of the people involved in intelligence in the United States at this time, in the military groups and other groups, they didn't share this vision of this kind of streamlined intelligence group. They kind of saw everybody kind of doing their own thing and talking together when they needed to. And of course, in the war, the OSS had shown its value, had shown its it had justified itself, and there were still people that were fighting against that idea. And I guess maybe you can kind of look at this as something similar to post 9/11, when we found out the FBI and the CIA just weren't talking to each other very well. Even though by that time, of course, they had a much better definition of what they were doing than they certainly did here in the late 1940s, but. Nevertheless, that's kind of what's going on here. And I think there's always these kind of growing pains when you kind of have to change things. And certainly World War II made us rearrange how we gathered intelligence. Just like 9/11, made us rearrange how we gather intelligence and use our intelligence agencies. Again, they bring in Sidney Sowers. Now, Sidney Sowers was a rear admiral in the war. He was a businessman. During the war, he'd kind of gained a name for himself. He had written really good intelligence reports on German U-boats. I think the Saint Nazaire in '42, there was the great raid against Saint Nazaire, but I think, if memory serves, that was still being used as it was used as U-boat pens about that time. And he wrote a lot kind of on the U-boats out of Saint Nazaire, and caught a lot of people's eyes there, and was appreciated for his analytical ability to analyze intelligence. Well, in January of 1946, so only a few months after the formal abolition of the OSS, I think it was George Clark was Truman's lawyer, one of his advisors and a lawyer, and he actually sets up this legal framework, this basic legal idea for the CIA group, Central Intelligence Group. This, again, it's ill-defined. It's not yet what it is, but it's the beginning of this centralization of power. And Schroeder kind of briefly covers kind of the brief time Sowers was there. He then looks at his successor, Hoyt Vandenberg. Vandenberg really did not want to be there. He was not particularly interested in that. I'm not sure Sowers was either, but Hoyt Vandenberg kind of saw it as a stepping stone rather than a destination. He wanted to be the first commander of an independent Air Force, which of course happens in 47, 48. So that's kind of where he was heading with that. And then, of course, Hillenkotter, who had been the attaché in Paris before the war. Hillenkotter, Roscoe Hillenkotter from Missouri, he will become the next director of the CIA. The last chapter of the book actually looks at how the CIA functioned as the premier intelligence agency of the United States in these early years of the Cold War, in these early crises of the Cold War. So there were, like I said, a number of political battles that occur here over the CIA, and the CIA kind of has to really fight to justify itself in these early years here. So the first thing, of course, that happens that really kind of shakes people's faith in the CIA was when the Soviets get the atomic bomb. They announced the atomic bombs in, I think, August of 49. People are like, well, how did this happen? I think the CIA was projecting the Soviets wouldn't have a bomb for at least another 5 years or so, and so this really shook things up. This really shook things up quite a bit. And then, of course, the following June, in June of 1950, you have North Korea invade South Korea, and of course, when North Korea invades South Korea, that's another thing that was not seen coming. It completely took the United States military by surprise. They didn't expect the North Koreans to engage upon that. CIA looks like it has egg on its face once again. There was also an incident, I want to say 1950, 49, 50, where George Marshall, who was Secretary of State, or he was... Well, it was while he was Secretary of State, so I'm trying to remember the chronology there, but it was while he was Secretary of State, he actually visited Bogota, Colombia, and there was some threat to him. There was a perception of an assassination attempt, and that kind of came out, and Hillenkotter, of course, has to justify that, and he actually does it quite well. The way he kind of, tells Congress, I think if memory serves, somebody said in Congress, one of the congressmen said to him, why haven't you, why didn't you know about this? And he says, well, we did. We tried to warn state. We told state several times this was going on, and we were ignored largely. And he made a lot of enemies there. He made a lot of enemies, including, and you got to remember, everything that's happening here at this time, in the late 40s, early 50s, it's within this kind of background of this kind of toxic Washington tapestry of the McCarthy era. This McCarthy era, of course, the stakes just seemed so much higher. It seemed like, of course, there were, communists were everywhere, and there certainly were communists in the United States government. Not to minimize that at all, and they did this country harm. But of course, as we know, the McCarthy era was kind of a scary time. Now, Allen Dulles, of course, who had served as the OSS station chief in Switzerland during the war, he kind of always coveted that top spot. He always wanted to be the director of Central Intelligence, and he's a bit of a schemer, and he organizes a kind of a campaign to take Hillenkotter down, and he launches an investigation against him and for some of these supposed failings. And so by the end of 1950, Hillenkotter steps down. He's no longer in charge there, and instead of appointing Dulles, Truman actually appointed Walter Bedell Smith for a couple of years, and then it's a while later Dulles gets in. But Walter Bedell Smith, of course, was Ike's chief of staff during World War II. So I mean, it kind of paints this kind of dirty politics that was going on here, and how the CIA was not only fighting to justify itself, but these leaders of the CIA were often under siege because of the perceived failings of the CIA, or the very real failings of the CIA sometimes. The book touches, like I say, on these characters, these figures like Dulles, like Smith, like George Kennan, the diplomat, kind of briefly talks about these guys and how they factor in. Now, the book itself as a whole is fairly light on analysis. I mean, it's a thin book, and some thin books are very, very densely packed with analysis. But this is a very thin book that is not. This is a book that is kind of a basic narrative overview of what happened. It's not a great analytical work, I don't believe. It moves far too quickly from kind of one area, one event to another. It kind of just bounces around. You would have liked a little more details. At least I would like more details kind of on the roots of the animosity between the services, the Army intelligence and Naval intelligence, toward the CIA. I really like that stuff. There was one point where golly, I can't remember who it was. It was one of the admirals or one of the heads of the service actually kind of said to the intelligence chiefs of Army and Navy, you need to coordinate with these guys. I mean, because they were dragging their feet, and he more or less took them aside and said, look, if you like your job, you're gonna do what this guy tells you to do. I don't remember the exact specifics, but it was something like that. So that was very interesting there, and I would have liked to see more of that. I would have loved to have learned more about that stuff. Also, too, I kind of wish he'd talked a little bit more about why Truman selected Smith instead of Dulles. I really, to me, Dulles has always been one of those fascinating characters. Both he and his brother, who wrote the War Guilt Clause in the Treaty of Versailles. Both Alice and John Foster Dulles are very, very interesting figures, and I would have liked to have learned a little bit more about kind of Truman's thinking there, why he went with Smith instead of Dulles. Now, so that, all that stuff would have been good, but my point is, it's kind of a light work when it comes to analysis. Elizabeth Edwards Spaulding wrote a great book called The First Cold Warrior a while back, and that was a really good book that I think analyzed Truman's role there at the beginning of the Cold War. The book, now having said all that, the book is generally correct and does a good job of saying, Truman was this focal character when it came to the Cold War. Truman was the guy that in many ways set the tone not only for intelligence gathering in the CIA, but he set the tone for the Cold War. He was the guy who really said, we're going to have a confrontational approach to the Soviets. You blockade Berlin, well, we're going to do an airlift. You invade South Korea, guess what? We're going to fight you. We're going to push it back. He had a very confrontational approach. In fact, I think it was, I want to say it was in September of 1945 when Molotov was on his way to San Francisco for the UN Charter, and he's complaining to Truman about something, and Truman kind of snaps at him, and Molotov says, well, I've never been talked to this way. And Truman said, well, you stick to your agreements, and no one will talk to you that way. And again, it's this kind of plain speaking loose cannon. You can't imagine Franklin Roosevelt talking to Molotov, the Soviet foreign minister. You can't imagine him talking to him that way. He wanted to charm him. He wanted to be friends with him. And Truman kind of understood, sometimes you got to talk tough to these guys. And so that was interesting, very interesting there as well. And the fact that Truman has a centrality in the book is very good. Obviously it goes in other directions here and there, but it always comes back to Truman. The book, because it's like I said, because it lacks kind of that more analytical stuff, it's not a very useful book for academics, generally speaking, I don't think. But having said this, I think this is a fantastic book for undergraduates or people who are just interested in the subject. I think it's a very accessible book. I think it's an easy read. It's a quick read. And, I think if you're somebody who's just generally interested in learning about, how the CIA came into being, I think Schroeder's book is a good one. So anyway, that was just my thoughts on Richard Schroeder's book, The Foundation of the CIA, Harry Truman, the Missouri Gang, and the Origins of the Cold War. Maybe we'll do one of these again pretty soon. Bye-bye.